Good evening, everybody. I'm John Allen Gay, the Executive Director of the John Quincy Adams Society. Apologies for the delay there. We were having some technical difficulties with our audio, but we should be working now. We're going to have a discussion tonight about the Russia situation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin and his role in it. But our guest tonight is Ambassador John Evans, who served in the U.S. Foreign Service from 1971 until 2006 in posts that included Tehran, Prague, Moscow, the NATO headquarters, St. Petersburg, Russia, and Armenia, where he served as the U.S. ambassador. He also led the State Department's Intelligence and Research Analytical Unit dealing with the former Soviet Union in 1999, just as Putin became prime minister, and then president of the Russian Federation. So, Ambassador Evans, welcome. And if you could tell us in particular about your time in St. Petersburg, which I believe was from 1994 to 1997, what the situation was like there at the time, what was going on locally, and how that fit into the broader U.S. Russian relationships. I think that's some good context to start with.
Thank you, John. I'd be glad to do that. But I first want to clarify something about the title for tonight, which you and I agreed on, Putin's Road to War. I wouldn't want anyone to be under the impression that the title means that this war is all about Putin, because it's about a lot more than just Putin. But what I can, and of course, I don't have all the answers. What I will try to do is help you understand what I saw in Putin. I haven't seen him for quite some time. It's not my place to communicate with him any longer, but I have followed him very carefully, including very much so in those years when I was in State Department intelligence. So let me just say that those were the glory years in a way, from our point of view in Russia. We had a fine consulate establishment. We were doing a lot of useful things. Almost every weekend, there would be a department secretary coming through, or a ship visit, or on one occasion, we actually had President Clinton in town. And we, on very short notice, I might add, and he kept us busy, believe me. He was there without Hillary, but I won't go further into that. It's just that we wanted to keep him busy, shall we say. And it was a very successful visit. So lots was going on. There were all sorts of people-to-people contacts, business contacts. There were groups like lawyers' associations, which are active there, a lot of international groups as well, and just a great deal of activity, which we thought, I mean, after all, this was the era of Bill and Boris, and Bill and Boris were getting along quite handsomely. And so we were in a supporting role. But we did a lot of good stuff right there in Petersburg. So it was one of the best assignments I've ever had. And one of the unexpected pluses of it was indeed that I did meet with Vladimir Putin, knowing, of course, nothing of what his future would be. In fact, he didn't know either. He was simply the deputy mayor. My main contact, of course, was Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, who was he was professor of law, and one of the great Democrats, small d, of the new Russia. And Vladimir Putin was his deputy and devoted to him, and I think learned a lot from Mr. Sobchak. But why don't you let me know if there's something else that I can particularly focus on.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about Sobchak and his administration in St. Petersburg, and kind of his place in Russian politics, such that Putin was coming up under this guy.
Yeah, well, Anatoly Sobchak was, as I said, a law professor. He was extremely well spoken. He could give wonderful speeches, explain democracy And for a time, he was looked at as very likely to go far in Russian politics. But the city of St. Petersburg, about 5 million inhabitants, was a city with a lot of problems, still is. A lot of crime, a lot of corruption, and various problems that gradually pulled Sobchak down. But I have to mention one thing early on, and that is at the time of the the putsch in 1991 against Gorbachev, when the conservative old guard saw that Gorbachev was down at his villa in the south, and they tried to stage a comeback for the old system. It turned out that Sobchak ended up with the only television channel that could broadcast to European Russia, because the putschists seized the television studios in Moscow and used them for their own purposes. But Sobchak was able to use Petersburg's Channel 4 to get his message of resistance to the coup, or not the coup, the putsch, out there. And I think it made a significant difference. And notably, Vladimir Putin was right by his side the whole time. Now, this was a pretty courageous thing for the two of them to do, because had the putsch succeeded, one can only imagine what those old timers would have done in terms of retribution for anyone who had tried to stand in their way. Fortunately for them, and I think fortunately for Russia, it turned out differently. Gorbachev stayed in place for the rest of his historic activity before the Soviet Union actually fell into its constituent parts. So that was the picture that we saw. And I should also simply add that there were a lot of Americans living in St. Petersburg and looking to the consulate as their sort of meeting place. And we had all sorts of lunches with people who were active in various fields, and we brought them together with Russians from St. Petersburg. It was a very, very stimulating and interesting moment.
And so you mentioned that you met Putin during this period. Tell us more about that. What was he like? What was your relationship like with him?
Well, it was very definitely an official relationship. I wasn't buddies with him. By the way, as you know, John, my former deputy, Andrew Goodman, just 2 days ago in War on the Rocks, published his own reminiscence of Putin, which is very different from mine. Andrew actually had some pretty long conversations with Putin when they were doing various things together. I mean, as I said, my main contact was Mayor Sobchak. But anybody who wants to read Goodman's piece and put it next to mine will see that we got quite different impressions. I have to caution, without getting into the details, that there was no love lost between Andrew Goodman and Vladimir Putin for a number of reasons. But whereas Andrew picked up a kind of a vindictive streak, my impression of Putin was very positive. The first real dealings I had with him involved some young American investors who had been 50-50 partners with some Russians in a Subway restaurant venture. Well, the Russians figured out how to make the sandwiches, and they decided they'd take over the whole business. So they brought in some muscle from the mob. And as a result, the young Americans were on our doorstep one evening, having been literally pursued in a big black truck or SUV by the mob. So I immediately called Putin and I said, "Look, we've got this situation. Can you help us?" And he said, "Absolutely, but the first thing I need to see is the contract." And that was that struck me, because Putin had studied law at the university, and his reaction was very much that of someone who had studied law, and he wanted to see the contract and find out what was at issue here. So we faxed the contract to him, and he was as good as his word. The next day, our young American investors were safely on a plane to Helsinki. Eventually, the matter all went to court. It took some time, but it was a very proper approach. And there were other things like that in which Putin seemed to be the best word I can come up with is correct. He was very correct about doing things according to the law as he saw it, wanting to do things the right way for Russia, of course, for St. Petersburg, and in the eyes of the world. Now, there may be, and there probably was, another side that we didn't see so much of, and there are rumors of that, and there's even some evidence of that. But what I saw was that this was a man who, first of all, kept his word. If he said he would do something, he did it. And I found him very professional. So I was as surprised as anybody when Yeltsin turned to him eventually to make him, well, the first job he got in the Kremlin after Sobchak lost the 1996 election, and Putin had been his campaign manager. So he basically ended up without a job. And he was in Moscow. He's just about to fly home, and he got a call saying, "Come on back. We think we've got a job for you." And he ended up in charge of the Kremlin's property office, which was at that time engaged in selling off state assets, which were no longer thought necessary, and to raise some cash because the budget was way down in the dumps. So, and then from that, he went to the FSB, the old that part of the KGB that he had been in, and then, of course, eventually, as Yeltsin was declining with his alcoholism and other problems, Yeltsin turned to him to try to save the situation, and in particular, he saw Putin as someone who would prevent the family, as they were called, the Yeltsin family, extended family, from running into serious legal trouble.
So in your contacts with Putin, did you ever discuss, some of the bigger geopolitical events going on at the time, like the Balkan Wars or the prospect of the big round of NATO expansion?
We may have, but I didn't know that he was going to be the future president of Russia. I talked to a lot of Russians in those days, and the Balkan Wars, particularly when we started bombing Serbia, that definitely came up. We had big, angry, demonstrations in front of the consulate. There was also a lot of sentiment against the expansion of NATO to the east. This is not something that has come lately to Putin's brain. It was all through the society. Even the very soft, mild-mannered Foreign Minister Kozyrev spoke about the danger of NATO's expanding too close to Russia's borders. So, and Yeltsin brought it up several times with President Clinton. So this is an old issue. One of the people I worked for, Ambassador Max Kampelman, once said to me, if NATO would just change its name, that would do something, because for all these years, Soviet citizens had it drummed into them that NATO was the big bad Western alliance that was going to do them harm. But that, of course, never happened, and now lots of other things have happened.
What was the impression, whether from Putin or from people in general, Russians in the period, of some of these economic reforms that were happening? Because I know, nowadays, there, one of the narratives you'll hear is, there was this radical liberalization of the economy that, that a lot of Americans participated in or encouraged or advised. And then that this was devastating to a lot of Russians, led to the emergence of oligarchs. And then that contributed to the frictions today. And I'm curious, whether being there in the period, whether you think that the evidence from the period fits that kind of narrative.
Well, that narrative is not false. For many, many people, it was absolutely the case. There were university professors who were scrounging around in trash cans to find food there. And Putin recently admitted himself that he drove a taxi during those years to make ends meet. So it was a time when budgets were bare because of the currency reform. People lost their life savings. It was a very, very difficult time for most Russians to survive. But there was a good side to it as well. I mean, it did get the country launched on a new track, but the pain involved was quite remarkable. And I think we might have been able to do a better job. But on the other hand, a lot of the money that Western countries and institutions forked over to Russia in those days just disappeared. And so the appetite for helping a country that obviously had major corruption problems started to fade, and there was a growing disenchantment on both sides in the late 90s, and it was the Balkan Wars, and I won't go into all the stories about that, how Primakov turned his airplane around in the mid-Atlantic when he heard we were bombing Serbia. And we almost got into a third world war at one point over antics at the airport. So things were going downhill. And then Yeltsin memorably abdicated on New Year's Eve of the new millennium and called on Russians to support Vladimir Putin. And I remember seeing a film clip of Putin just as Yeltsin was shaking hands with him, and Putin had told him before, I don't think I'm up to this job. This is a really big job. He looked so sort of uncertain about this responsibility. But then, of course, he plunged into it, and the first thing he had to do was complete the Chechen war, because Yeltsin's first attempt didn't pan out at all or very well. And Putin organized things and worked with the military. And of course, it was a bloody conflict. But eventually they got to a stage of stability, which is held pretty well, although with lots of flaws in the human rights area in particular.
Yeah, and so the impression that I've gotten is that this Chechen conflict, the Second Chechen War, was really central to Putin's elevation, as a national political figure and to his popularity. Could you tell us a bit more about that conflict and maybe his place in it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very violent conflict because the Russian troops really waged this war as if they were marching to Berlin in 1945. I mean, it was very destructive. But you have to keep in mind that there had been a lot of terrorism in Russia by this time. People on the subway and in various other places. And so Putin ended up being the hero for having essentially damped down terrorism coming from that quarter. Now, there's been terrorism since, unfortunately. A lot of it is linked with forces in the North Caucasus, in Chechnya, Dagestan, and places like that. But Putin was seen as a strong figure who was going to get things running again. And indeed, salaries, which had not been paid under Yeltsin many times, started to be paid properly. Pensions started to be paid, and some serious organizational work was done to get things running again, get the trains running on schedule, all those things that had sort of fallen apart, and had given democracy a bad name with many Russians. They thought, if this is democracy, we don't want it. We want somebody who can run our country and get things going well. And Putin turned out to have a pretty good sense of what people wanted. I think he did listen. He talked to a lot of people, and he was quite successful in lifting Russia back up from its knees, as the Russians always said.
Do you think that there was some sort of turning point here, where, we see Putin in the 1990s, working for this, kind of somewhat liberal, reform-minded administration in St. Petersburg, stepping into power, not seeming very self-confident, as you were saying, at the presidency, to now where he's definitely not seen, at least outside, as a liberal or a reformer, or as someone who lacks confidence in wielding power, and someone who a lot of people see as wanting to remain in power until the day he dies. I mean, is this something? Is there a continuity here? Is there a rupture? Did something change for him?
Yes, things did change, but it was a gradual process, I believe. And it, of course, we're mainly thinking about the international arena, and it shouldn't have been a surprise to us that Putin made this. He changed because we did some things that weren't very smart. We pulled out of the ABM treaty. We talked to the Russians even about possibly joining NATO, but it was seen to be false. You'll remember at the time of even before Putin was in place, there was this issue of Secretary Baker saying, if the Soviet Union would accept a united Germany within within NATO, NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. Now, being here in the Washington area, that's been a sore point and a matter for debate by many, many people. And the new book that Professor Sarote at Johns Hopkins has put out, which is entitled Not 1 Inch, is a very good account of how we got to the point of actually dangling NATO membership in front of Georgia and Ukraine, which happened most notably at the NATO Bucharest summit in April of 2008, against the wishes of the Germans and French, by the way. So we didn't even have consensus within NATO to talk about Ukraine and Georgia. Well, I think the first turning point had to have been our actions in the Balkans, because that was seen as not sanctioned by the United Nations. It was NATO not being in a defensive posture, but going out of area, as we used to say. So that was the first thing. And I think the expansion or enlargement of NATO was the other red line. I don't think the red line was fully crossed with the first 3 Visegrad states that entered. But when we started getting closer and closer, and particularly when we brought in the Baltics and started talking about Ukraine and Georgia, it was not just Putin, but it was the entire upper strata of the bureaucracy and the foreign policy elite in Russia that said, "Now, wait a minute, this is just going too far." And of course, the color revolutions that took place, the one in Georgia, the Rose Revolution, so-called, and then the one in Ukraine. Those were both seen as, if not engineered by the CIA, which I don't think they really were, they were seen as very threatening to the stable order in Russia. And I'm sure Putin felt threatened himself. So, it was only 4 months after that Bucharest summit that the war with Georgia took place. And Misha Saakashvili was a little bit, shall we say, headstrong. We told him again and again, don't poke the bear in the eye. But during the opening of the Beijing Olympics, he decided to pull a fast one. And he tried to take over South Ossetia by force of arms and ended up killing some Russian peacekeepers there. So that went badly, and you saw the invasion then of Georgia, but they didn't take the whole country. They stopped, pulled back, but as a consequence, both Abkhazia and South Ossetia were recognized as independent, and that's still the awkward case for Georgia. And then when things started going a little bit haywire in Ukraine from their point of view in 2013 and 2014, that really got the Russians upset. And when the demonstrations on the Maidan ended up with chasing Yanukovych, the duly elected, though highly corrupt, president of Ukraine, when he was forced to flee, this really upset the Russians. And that's when Putin seized Crimea, mainly because of the naval installations in Crimea. And then it was not long after that the Russians started giving covert support to the separatists in the Donbass. And I might just stop for a second there on that question of the Donbass, because in our narrative, there was no separatist movement. It was a Russian invasion. That's not the case. Even before, back in the 90s, there had been some problems between the West and the East of Ukraine. And so these problems were festering. The problems between Ukraine and Russia festered during all this time as well. It didn't come out of the blue. But it's true that the Russians were assisting those separatist groups in Luhansk and Donetsk. And since then, there's been this, they call it a low-grade conflict that's been going on for the last 8 years. It's not low grade if your house gets rocketed. And the Ukrainians put some serious forces into that, what became kind of a stalemated situation. So I think all of these things weighed on not only Putin, but the group around him, not only the people he brought from Petersburg, but the people we know as the Siloviki, the people who run the intelligence and military and internal interior ministry, that sort of thing. All of them, and a large segment of the Russian public were appalled by what happened in Ukraine. And the problems have just been getting worse and worse. I think what I'd say about the role of NATO enlargement here is that, we didn't cause this to happen, this war, but we probably aggravated and abetted it in some ways. There were already conditions there, but we probably, by action or inaction, not understanding the situation perhaps, and also by cleaving so tightly to this principle that every sovereign nation can choose its alliances. Well, that's a nice idea, but it hasn't worked in in this hemisphere very well. And it wouldn't work if Mexico tried to ally itself with China, for example. So anyway, the Russians have a wonderful saying: even kittens aren't born all on their own, all by themselves. There's always prior cause for just about everything that happens.
Yeah, well, and we've got space in the questions for folks who want to ask questions from Ambassador Evans in the Q&A. There's a box at the bottom where you can type in your question. Feel free to ask some questions, and I'll work them in. But I guess just to bring it up right to the present, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why Putin chose to actually invade Ukraine. And also seems to have really botched the initial round of the fighting, because there was talk, for instance, at the beginning of the Zelensky administration that there could be this rapprochement. Zelensky had run against Poroshenko, in part as kind of seen as something of a peace candidate and someone who favored reconciliation. And, toward the end, toward the last few months before the war, we were hearing about some of the building internal frictions in Ukraine. But what was the proximate cause for Russia that led to this? And why did they make such a bungle of the first round?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things here. First of all, I think last year the Ukrainians were sending out signals that they really were going to try to take the Donbass area back. And you may remember back in 2020, the Turkish drones, the Bayraktar drones, appeared in the war that Baku waged against the Armenians in Karabakh. And those drones fighting against Russian equipment, which the Armenians had, were deadly. And in late October, the Ukrainians tried one of those drones against Donbass, and it was highly successful. And I believe that really worried the Russians. They were getting indications that there might be a major move against Donbass, and they would be defeated. They didn't want to see that happen. There was also a big conference about Crimea attended by officials of all the NATO countries. And Zelensky, who, you're quite right, he went from being really a proponent of negotiated settlement to being very hawkish. And at this Crimea conference, they declared that recovery of Crimea was going to be their top goal. And also at one of the meetings in Paris of the ill-fated Normandy group, Zelensky made it clear that he wasn't going to go along with the provisions of the Minsk the roadmap to a settlement, which was provided by the Minsk II agreement. So all of these things were starting to add up. And I do think also that the Russians must have been aware of a lot of the training activity and arms shipments that were already showing up in Ukraine. And I think I don't think that Putin had been planning this for a long time. I think he had been hoping that maybe this show of force, when they had all the forces arrayed on three sides of Ukraine, that maybe sort of a pressure campaign could get the Ukrainians back to the table. But that wasn't to be. And on the 24th of February, they moved after, of course, having declared the independence or recognized the independence of those two little statelets, and then responded allegedly to protect them. I think actually, there's a big thing about no one in Russia is allowed to call this a war. It's a special military operation. And I actually think that's accurate when you look at what they tried to do in Kiev. At the beginning, it looked like they wanted to just sort of, like a police force, whisk into Kiev and decapitate. They also had a bunch of paratroopers coming on a big transport to the military air base, and of course that got shot down. And today I read that it got shot down because we knew exactly where it was, and we enabled the Ukrainians to hit it. But in any case, I think it may have been also a kind of a feint. I think the operation in the north, but they obviously got terribly bogged down. They got a bloody nose. They got a bloody nose also in Kharkiv, apparently, and so they have now gone back to looking at the southern areas. Of course, they've solved the water supply problem that Crimea was enduring because the Ukrainians had blocked the water canal supplying water to Crimea. And then there's been this horrible drawn out battle of Mariupol, which is still going on. So yes, there's been a change. I think, our military people say you go to war with the army you have. And that's what the Russians did. They went to war with, well, it wasn't the conscript army because they haven't called for a full mobilization. That may yet happen. But they went with the forces they had, which were badly led, not properly equipped, surprised that they were where they were because the troops hadn't been apparently forewarned that they were going on a campaign into Ukraine. So I think for all those reasons they got it. And then of course the flagship of the Black Fleet, Moskva, was hit by two Ukrainian missiles and sank. So yeah, it's looking like a huge miscalculation on the part of Putin and his ruling group. I think it was a miscalculation. They didn't understand very much about Ukraine. They imagined, as we did when we went to Iraq, that it would be a cakewalk, that people would greet them with flowers. And that's simply not today's Ukraine. So now we're in a different stage of this thing, and I'm afraid it's going to be bloody and very harmful for both countries. And of course, we have a war fever raging in our own midst, where no one can even question the idea that we shouldn't do absolutely everything short of boots on the ground to help Ukraine. And of course, President Zelensky has turned out to be such a master of the media that it's very hard for anyone to even raise their hand and question whether this is good for the United States.
So, that I think leads to another question of how likely do you think escalation is at this point? Not merely of the war within Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine, and conversely, the prospects of diplomatic settlement. If there's a lot of dispute about just how capable the Russians are of really sustaining an offensive in the Donbass right now, which would create incentives for them to try to end it by any means.
Well, I think there is a very real danger that if the Kremlin comes to the conclusion that they're going to either lose just there in Donbass or lose in an even more significant way, it's already viewed as an existential struggle in the Russian press. And that's pretty scary because what do countries facing an existential threat do? They reach for whatever's available, and in the case of Russia, they have more nuclear weapons than anybody else, and they happen to have quite a lot of these so-called tactical nuclear weapons. And I don't think it's highly likely, but the risk is not zero that at some point they may decide they've got to use a nuclear weapon of some sort to bring the West to its senses, as they would think. And let's just hope that if that happens, we can all get through it without bringing about a total conflagration, as we've been doing during the Cold War. It's very risky. It's probably more risky than the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think. I would be very happy to see the United States doing something which it probably cannot do now, and that is urging negotiations, because the Minsk agreement may not be perfect, but its existence makes clear that there was a diplomatic way forward for Ukraine and Russia, short of this terrible war. Crimea, I think, is a lost cause. If the Ukrainians think they can win that back, I think they're crazy. It's just not going to happen. The Russians won't even sit down at the table to talk about it, and they will expend whatever it takes to keep the Crimea. So what I would hope is that there will be what specialists call a hurting stalemate, at which point both sides will say, okay, this is enough. We've hurt ourselves. Let's sit down and talk this through and find a diplomatic solution.
So going back to this Russian decision to go in, there's a lot of question. One of the images that goes around that we see is, Putin kind of in isolation, meeting his advisors from the far end of these long tables, writing these long essays about history, and then making this bad decision. There are questions about, like, is he still rational? Is he listening to his advisors? Jennifer in the questions asks, is he is his relationship with his advisors possibly part of the miscalculation here?
Well, my temptation, I don't want to sound flip, but it's very Russian, all of those things. They have big, long tables in Russia. The leader is in a very special position, and often the geography of the room and the furniture and so on signals that. And Russians love to write long essays about history. So, to someone who's had a lot of interaction with the Russians, this doesn't seem all that strange. From what I can tell, Putin has the loyalty of his immediate colleagues, and I think he does listen to them. He is one thing that I can be sure of from having known the man before is that he's not a psychopath. He's not Hitler. He's not Satan. He's not Darth Putin or anything like that. He's not totally risk averse. In fact, he has admitted that when he was in the intelligence services, he was known for being willing to take risks. And that may have played into this. But basically, I don't think we can put all of this on Putin. Russian society thinking the way it does. And let's remember the agency of the Ukrainians, who've done some things that have really, today they were pulling up some more monuments to Ukrainian-Russian friendship, and they've already pulled down most of the Lenins. And there's even the statue of Catherine the Great that's on the list. So the Ukrainians they really know how to get the Russians goat, and they've done a fair amount of that. So I think we've played a role that we always mean well. We intend to do the right thing, but often we don't think it through carefully enough, and we don't know when to stop. If we think we're promoting democracy, my God, we're going to promote democracy, whether you like it or not. So there are a lot of factors here And they've all combined in this most tragic way. And once the violence is released, the way it has been, we've seen these awful the footage of what's happened outside of Kiev. We don't yet. I don't think we can yet say that was a genocide. It certainly there were some crimes committed there. Whether they were war crimes or something else, I'm not sure. But once these emotions have been released, it's very difficult to put things back together in any sensible way. And I'm afraid that these two countries are going to be, we can't say when this war is going to end. The sooner the better for the rest of the world, because it's having this terrible effect on prices and supplies and food and so on. But even when it ends, I think this is going to be an area of serious tension for years to come.
A question from Thomas in the audience. Why does Russia see the battle with Ukraine as existential?
It's partly due to the memory of empire. Now, I don't really want to compare the Falklands to it, because the Falklands is a pretty small deal, but it was a big deal for a lot of people in Britain. So it's, Ukraine has Crimea goes back to 1783 when Potemkin won Crimea from the Turks for Catherine the Great. And there was the Battle of Poltava, in which Peter the Great defeated the Swedes and his Ukrainian allies in 1708, I think it was. So there's a lot of history here, and it's history for good and bad. There are a lot of families that are mixed, Ukrainian and Russian. The previous Russian ambassador here, Mr. Kislyak, is from a Ukrainian family. He identifies as a Russian, and he works for the Russian foreign ministry, or did. But we can't even comprehend, I think, the amount of complication in this relationship. I mean, it's in literature, it's in art, it's in theater, it's in social relations. There's a ecclesiastical dimension, as you know, with the new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and a lot of memories. And there, I have to say, for the record, there also is, despite many, many denials, there is a neo-Nazi element in Ukraine. It's not in parliament to any extent, but it's in the streets. And these right-wing folks who, have torchlight marches and sing old songs and talk about the great Stepan Bandera, who worked with Hitler and so on. This really gets the Russians goat. And it also affects what Zelensky can probably do. The idea of negotiating right now with the Russians is very unpopular on the street in Ukraine, I understand. That's where it needs to go. It needs to go into negotiations, but both sides have to be ready for that.
And we've got a question from Trevor, who's asking about some of these current issues, with how Russia sees and interacts with the outside world. The suspicion of the West, the problematic interaction with Ukraine, possible nostalgia for parts of the Soviet legacy. How much do you think this will persist, even if Putin were to leave Russian politics? Are they part of just a deeper mood in Russian society, or a deeper tendency?
I think a lot of it is very deep rooted, and you can look back at former times in Russia and identify a lot of for example, the suspicion of the West, the feeling that the West is after us. Those things, those are constants. actually, I think when Putin took over, he was very disposed towards the West. His German was fluent. When he went to the Bundestag, he addressed them in what he called the language of Goethe and Schiller. And then he closed the base at Lourdes in Cuba that was spying on us. He closed the port at Kamran Bay. He allowed us to resupply Afghanistan through the through Russian territory. And I think he really wanted a good relationship with the West. But as things started stacking up in the opposite ledger, disappointments, betrayals, and other dangers, I think he gradually came around with many other Russians. And of course, it's not a full democracy. They do have elections, and they work hard to get votes, but it's a very small coterie of influential people who really make the decisions. And I don't think that would change with say if Putin just up and died tomorrow. I think there's a very good chance that somebody more nationalistic and more determined might come to power. So I don't think that's going to be a solution. I mean, he is going to be gone at some point. We'll see. But it doesn't. It looks like a nice daydream for Western armchair historians to think about. I just don't think that. I mean, we know his polling numbers have actually gone up during this operation.
So we got a question from Toby Shustak, who asks about Russo-Turkish relationships. You know, what are they looking like these days? How have they been, the last 10, 15 years? And we can pivot to another question if you don't want to go that direction.
I don't want to go deeply into it, except to say that it is really remarkable. I mean, these are two countries that when they were empires, real empires, they fought each other numerous times in bloody battles, mostly for control of the Black Sea. But at one point, the Russians wanted to take Constantinople. So there's a lot of history, but there's a grudging respect between the two. And the two leaders right now, Putin and Erdogan, are able to work together one day and put sticks in the other guy's spokes the next day. It's one of those strange relationships. They both fear each other and they need each other and they sell each other. The Russians sell energy and they're building a nuclear plant for Turkey. So it's really a remarkable sort of frenemies kind of situation.
Yeah. So another question, relating, I guess, to part of your later career, what is your view of Russia's role as a peacekeeper in this Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan?
I don't want to get too far afield from our main topic here, but I do think that there is a genuine desire to prevent an ethnic cleansing happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. That does not exclude other motives that the Kremlin may have. The Russian peacekeepers I observed when I worked in Transnistria really were carrying out peacekeeping tasks and guarding the big munitions store at Kolbasna there. So I don't think we should. The narrative in this country is that Russia invaded Moldova. And that's not true. I mean, the Russian 14th Army was in Moldova when the Moldovans and the Transnistrians started fighting, and he broke them up, broke up the fight and pacified it, basically. So I don't think we should be totally skeptical of Russian peacekeeping operations. Also, in some of these other areas, it's necessary to field peacekeepers at times. And it was definitely the case in this 2020 situation where if they hadn't stepped in, and they stepped in very, very quickly once there was a peace to be kept, there would have been a terrible bloodbath, I think.
So yeah, just to kind of close out here, just a question for, a lot of the folks in our audience are early career professionals, mid-career professionals, or are students. And a lot of them have tuned in because they're interested in Russia, in the greater, Russia adjacent world, and, maybe want to work on that issue set in their future. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts? What would your advice be to these folks on how to develop your expertise, your experience, your knowledge, your understanding of Russia? How do you, even from the basic stuff of like, if you can't go to Russia, how are you going to pick up the language? But also stuff like, who should they be reading? What should they be emphasizing in their own studies and preparation to try to be competitive and also good at their jobs?
Well, that's a big question. But, George Kennan couldn't go to the Soviet Union when he was a young diplomat. He learned Russian mostly in this country, but then he went to Latvia, and which was the listing post at that time. So there is now a difficulty to get to Russia. And in fact, Ukraine is not a safe place at the moment either. Problem areas need experts to work on them, however. If there's an area that is problem-free, no one's going to be interested in it. There's going to be a lot more interest in Russia and the surrounding area after all that has happened than we might have predicted. China is, of course, the other very important theater for anyone interested in foreign affairs. My advice is you've got to read every day. You've got to keep up with the literature. You've got to read the classics about diplomacy and about foreign policy. You've got to just really be on top of your brief. But at the same time, it's good to get to know a lot of people and network. If you're studying, it's very good to get to know the professors and the other students. Some of those other students are going to end up in interesting work, and it's always good to know them. Foreign affairs is a wonderful area to work in because almost no knowledge will go wasted. Anything you're able to know, any particular sideline that you're interested in, even sometimes hobbies, it all works in this very rich field. I remember that I think it was George Kennan who was playing tennis in Moscow when he was tipped off by a German diplomat on the tennis court that the Hitler-Stalin pact was coming. So it's a wonderful career. Now the State Department is going through some re-engineering, but they just took in a new class of 179 new officers. So I think they're rebuilding, but there are many, many other options. And my last bit of advice would be precisely develop options, your options, whether it's to go into academia or go into government or work in business or in some kind of a nonprofit. You may very likely move between those different areas, and each time you'll be moving up and you'll be seeing a wider field of endeavor. So I wish all your young professionals the very, very best, and don't give up just because there's trouble in the world. That's what diplomacy is all about, is trying to deal with trouble.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you very much to Ambassador John Evans for taking the time to speak with us tonight about your experiences, your thoughts on some of these very critical issues. Our next event is going to be on the 11th of May, so 2 weeks from today, on Iran with Nagar Mortazavi. Please feel free to check out any of our events. We're likely to launch some reading groups soon as well. Everybody have a wonderful evening.